Hello, everybody, and welcome to our VIA Pioneer Speaker Series. My name is Ryan Nemec, and I'm the Education Director of the VIA Institute on Character. And I'm very excited, actually, to introduce our speaker here today. But before I do that, I wanted to note a couple different things. One is just to let all of you know, some of you might be new to this speaker series, to let you know that our intention with this VIA Pioneer Speaker Series is really to bring forth some of the best practitioners in the world in their particular fields who are actually applying character strengths. And so, as many of you know, we started with the coaching and counseling track at the end of last year. We spent several months on the business track, and now we are in the education track. So we're happy to be in our second month of that track, which will go probably about 5 or so months long, and sort of a prototype for this track. One of the perfect people to be presenting is Mark Linkins. And before I introduce Mark, I want to say that you can maybe take a look at the slides here. You can also see that there are some different pieces, different things going on at VIA, some different reports that we have. We always make the comment that there's one VIA survey but 3 reports as a way to remember it. So you can, anybody that takes the VIA survey can then receive any of 3 different reports based on those same VIA survey results. And so you can see there on the screen there's a team report that people can get where that is aggregated by teams. And so consultants are using this report. There's a VIA Pro report, which is for practitioners like coaches and counselors and psychologists and educators working in a one-on-one situation with people. And then there's a VIA Me report, and that's our report that's for consumers, kind of a little bit lighter, more user-friendly, kind of more practical tips, that kind of thing. And then we have, of course, a number of different VIA workshops going on, so please visit our site, viapros.org, and you can learn about a number of different workshops, one of which is actually starting in about a week. And that'll be co-led by myself and Dr. Donna Mayerson, who's VIA's practice director. And it's a course that we actually do live. Has limited enrollment because it's live, and people actually interact live on the phone calls. And so we're able to, with this innovative technology, we're able to split people up in groups no matter what country you're in and work on different exercises relating to character strength. So that's a lot of fun. So, and again, doing all these different things before I introduce Mark, I'm keeping you in suspense here. But I do want to say one more thing, and this is actually with a very heavy heart, that I have some very sad news to let you know about in case you don't know. But yesterday, Chris Peterson passed away. Now, Chris Peterson is VIA. He is the lead creator of the VIA classification, who led the charge with Marty Seligman and 55 scientists to create the VIA classification about a decade ago. And I always refer to Chris also not only as VIA science director, but also as one of the founding fathers of positive psychology. And we don't really have many more details than that he passed away in his apartment in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he was a very distinguished professor at the University of Michigan, which is actually regarded by many people as the #1 psychology program in the United States. So, so it's very sad to lose a great man like that. And I know he was a lot of good connections with so many people in positive psychology and beyond. So that's with a heavy heart. I want to then connect that to Mark Linkins, because Mark Linkins, coincidentally or synchronistically, got a chance to know Chris Peterson and got a chance to collaborate with him in some of his work at Geelong Grammar School in Australia, and so he'll make a comment or two as well. So continuing a little bit more on Mark, Mark is the lead consultant for educational practices at the VIA Institute. And so what that means is that he's really leading the charge for bringing VIA character strengths throughout the Cincinnati region in training teachers, and also beyond that to places in the United States. He's also been recently traveling to Brazil, bringing character strength practices to areas of to very poor areas, the slum areas in Brazil, and also spent 6 months doing the work at Geelong Grammar School, which, as many of you know, was really the leading institution in terms of positive education that Marty Seligman was leading up many years ago. So, and also I should say that Mark was the co-project director of the Strathaven project, and so that forms a lot of the research base for this work in character strengths and positive education. So it's very exciting to have Mark here, and keep in mind some of Mark's signature strengths as you listen to him speak here today. So some of Mark's signature strengths are appreciation of beauty and excellence, curiosity, fairness, forgiveness, and kindness. So you might even practice a little strength spotting as you listen to him, because as we always say, you can spot these character strengths in virtually any situation. So without further ado, and I should tell you, Mark and I actually are sitting next to each other, so it's kind of a privilege to be able to do it this way, where I can just literally take off the headset right now and hand it to Mark, and we'll go back and forth that way. And if you have any questions for Mark, please email me directly at ryan@viacharacter.org. ryan@viacharacter.org. And so without further ado, I'll hand the headset over to Mark Linkins.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm just adjusting the headset. There we go. So I'd like to thank all of you for joining this morning, wherever you may be. And there is figuring out what to focus on in the limited time that we have here, because the scope of VIA in education is very broad, and there are really two strands related to VIA in education. One is professional development, and one is student interventions and VIA-based curriculum. So for our purposes today, I thought it would be best to focus on the student level. So we'll reference some professional development initiatives, but the primary focus is going to be interventions at the student level. So I want to begin by referencing a book which you may be familiar with. It's currently number 5 on the New York Times bestseller list. It's Paul Tough's book, How Children Succeed, Grit, Curiosity, and the Hidden Power of Character. And for many of our listeners, the content of the book will be fairly familiar. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the research basis which Tough references in his book. But the reason I wanted to start with this is because this book has been getting a lot of attention, at least in the U.S., both in educational circles and both with respect to parenting. And I think the central premise of this book really makes the case very clearly for why strengths, character strengths matter, and specifically why they matter in education and why they matter with children. It's a book that I believe is attracting a larger audience than many of the more mainstream positive psychology texts. Paul Tough is an ex-New York Times journalist, and I think that the reach of this book is significant. And I want to start with sort of his central premise, and the figure that looms largest in Tough's text is James Heckman, professor of economics from the University of Chicago and Nobel laureate. Back in the 90s, Heckman was involved in some research looking at various performance factors and and indicators of success related to 3 subgroups. And specifically, he was interested in looking at high school dropouts who earn GEDs. And how do those students fare in relation to their counterparts who graduate and the other students who drop out but don't earn GEDs? And in looking at comparing these groups, an interesting trend emerged. He looked at both cognitive ability and likelihood of future success. And when we look at likelihood of future success, he was looking across multiple domains. He was looking at success in the workplace, success in relationships. It was a pretty broad examination of success across various life domains. And the interesting thing that he found was that while high school graduates and GED recipients were essentially on par in terms of academic skills and cognitive ability, and both groups were comparable and were significantly higher than high school dropouts without GEDs. When you looked at likelihood of future success, the high school dropouts with GEDs did not appear to have the same advantage at all with respect when compared with high school graduates. So as a group, even though the GED recipients were comparable in terms of cognitive ability, their likelihood of future success was significantly lower. This was interesting to Heckman because Heckman observed that our culture and specifically our educational system is premised upon the notion that cognitive ability is the primary predictor of success. And when you look at our structures of education, when you look at funding for education, you see that this paradigm is dominant and has been dominant for many years. But as this study points out, that assumption may be incorrect. And in fact, Heckman termed this belief that cognitive ability sort of determines success and is the primary indicator of success is the cognitive hypothesis. And so we have cognitive skills, and those are the academic skills, this example solving a math problem. But there are other skills, non-academic skills, skills that, that we know as character strengths and that Heckman referred to as non-cognitive skills. And based on Heckman's work and others in the same field, Angela Duckworth at the University of Penn and Marty Seligman, we understand that these non-cognitive skills, these character strengths, are in fact important predictors of academic success, success in the workplace, and elsewhere. Again, this is nothing probably new to most of our listeners, but the reason I'm sharing this is because this message is now getting broadly disseminated in educational circles with parents, and I think maybe gaining traction that heretofore wasn't there. I just want to share the beginning of an article that Heckman wrote in 2001. He says, it's common knowledge outside of academic journals that motivation, tenacity, trustworthiness, and perseverance are important traits for success in life. And he cites the maxim from Thomas Edison that genius is 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. And he also cites the stories that we share with young children and the messages that are clearly embedded in there. The perseverance in the little engine that could, patience, perseverance, and perhaps a touch of social intelligence in the story of the tortoise and the hare. Heckman continues, it is thus surprising that academic discussion of skill and skill formation almost exclusively focus on measures of cognitive ability and ignore non-cognitive skills. Some of you may be familiar with Duckworth's research on grit, and in a 2004 study, she and Dr. Seligman found that self-control in this particular study was a better predictor of academic success than IQ, which clearly shows the important role that these non-cognitive skills play. Chris Peterson and Nansuk Park in 2009 study found that the character strengths of perseverance, love, gratitude, hope, and perspective were in fact predictors of high grade point average. When we go beyond success in the academic domain, of course we know that character strengths are many of the 24 character strengths are linked to life satisfaction. 3 of those strengths that have the strongest correlations: gratitude, zest, and hope. I just want to reference a relevant prevailing paradigm regarding education. And I think that when you look at existing educational structures, you see that this view of teaching and learning has been in place and by and large continues. And I think it points to the problem that Heckman identifies. So it's this notion that the student comes into the classroom as an empty vessel. And the process of teaching is the process of filling that empty vessel with knowledge. So the teacher is the dispenser of wisdom. The student is the somewhat passive recipient. According to this view, the goal is to see how much knowledge we can cram into that vessel. But the problem is what happens when we focus all of our attention on what goes into the vessel rather than focusing on the vessel itself, which in this metaphor is the student. So especially in the past 10 years since No Child Left Behind legislation, our focus in education has been, and this has been as a result of a federal mandate, and then as that mandate is expressed at the state level, increasingly the focus is on a very narrow subset of academic skills: literacy and numeracy. You're probably all familiar with the fact that many other disciplines have lost funding, and in fact many schools in some areas have even done away with arts programs altogether. So increasingly, education is focusing on a narrower set of skills, albeit very important skills, literacy and numeracy, but narrow nonetheless. So what does happen when we continue to try to cram more information into the vessel and rather than focusing on the student himself or herself? And that's what we get, a leaky vessel. And so I think that it's safe to assume that this paradigm isn't sufficient, and largely because it fails to recognize that as students come to us, they come to us with existing talents and strengths. Those potentials are already there, and too often our instructional practices fail to acknowledge those inherent capacities. And we do a disservice on many levels, but even if our goal, if the primary goal of the educational system is academic achievement, I think we're even defeating ourselves here because we're not tapping and using those strengths that can really help to promote achievement. We're instead just focusing again on what goes into the bucket, so to speak. I think a more balanced view of teaching and learning is reflected in this graph. The traditional view essentially focuses on ignores the circle on the top left and focuses exclusively on new knowledge and skills. But I think if we can combine our approach, both new knowledge and skills, and building upon and recognizing and calling out those existing talents, I think we can realize the full potential for learning and growth. When we work with teachers in the professional development modules related to VIA, we typically begin with this fundamental question: what is the most important lesson that you learned from one of your teachers? So putting teachers in the role of student, always a good practice. And so teachers write a statement and where they identify a particular teacher who had a very positive impact, and they explain what was it that they gleaned from that teacher. The most important lesson, and just a few examples. These are actually some examples from Wallingford-Swarthmore School District, of which Strathaven High School is part of that district. These are actually teachers who currently teach in the district, but also were students in the district. And Kathy's most important lesson learned goes back to second grade, where she said, "I learned that my actions can affect how other people feel." Very important life lesson that I think touches on a couple character strengths, including social intelligence. Jessica spoke about her experience in Miss Farrell's creative writing class and the important lessons she learned regarding perseverance. Molly learned a very valuable lesson in Mrs. Jones' 5th grade class when she learned that she didn't have to be the loudest person in the class in order to get people to listen. Very useful and practical lesson that again touches on character strengths. And inevitably, when we ask teachers to identify these most important lessons learned, what they identify are these life lessons, these lessons that speak to the essence of who we are, that speak to our character. This is not to say that the academic lessons aren't important, but the lessons that are most profound and that we carry with us throughout our lives, these are the lessons of character. This is nothing new. Aristotle said educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. More recently, Martin Luther King expressed a similar sentiment: intelligence plus character, that's the goal of true education. So, we have a system that I believe, an educational system that is largely out of balance, that focuses entirely on the left-hand side of this slide and doesn't sufficiently recognize the importance of what's on the right-hand side of the slide. And I think when we talk about character strengths and skills, even though they clearly are important, cognitive skills and non-cognitive skills are by nature different. They're complementary. And the character strengths, I like this metaphor. This is actually a metaphor, I believe, from Neil Mayerson, that character strengths are the fuel and the runner that energize and direct our talents. I think that is one of many ways in which character strengths and talents relate. So I'm assuming that most listeners are well aware of the VIA classification, and I would like to make a point which I think, and I think this is an important distinction. A lot of times when I speak with people and mention that I'm involved with VIA in education, there's an initial assumption which is made, and that is that VIA in education is primarily about a survey. And while the VIA survey is an important tool that can be used, my notion of VIA-based education is focused on the use of this classification of strengths, that the classification of strengths is what defines VIA education. You could conceivably have VIA-based education without ever administering a survey. And in fact, in the younger grades and in the early elementary grades, there are a number of VIA-based programs, and those students don't take the VIA survey. What is absolutely fundamental is the classification of strengths and the role that plays in terms of framing the language that we use to talk about who we are at our best. It's also language that gets infused within the curriculum, not just to talk about who we are at our best, but who our peers are at their best. And for really engaging in both looking inward at our own strengths, but looking outward at the strengths in those around us. So I just wanted to clarify, I don't want to diminish the importance of the VIA survey, but the survey is simply a tool. The classification is the framework upon which everything is built. I'm just going to show you the practices that I'm going to share with you are drawn from a number of different school settings, some of which I've been directly involved with, some of which I have had discussions with people who've been involved. 3 of these interventions are broad positive psychology interventions that include significant VIA components. And that would be the case for Strathaven High School, Geelong Grammar School, and Pastor Cicero. I've worked with each of those schools, and their VIA is important, but it's within the context of a broader positive psychology base. In addition, there are a number of VIA-specific interventions, and these are interventions which focus exclusively on VIA. And I just noticed an error. Pastor Cicero in Brazil, that actually was on the first slide, and I inadvertently included it here. These are schools that are doing VIA-specific interventions. In some instances, the VIA interventions reflect explicit curriculum, explicit VIA-related lessons where students work with their strengths. In some other instances, for instance, the Shanghai American School, and we'll reference that a little later, the VIA is embedded within a curricular discipline, but even though it's embedded in a curricular discipline, the focus is on the individual strengths and how do strengths inform what we do. I don't think there's any understanding strengths as an intellectual exercise might be interesting, but I don't think that's not the value that we're looking for. We're looking for the value in all interventions, whether it's explicit or embedded. How do these strengths inform our understanding of ourselves, and how does it inform our understanding of others, and how do these strengths ennoble us and help us in our lives in a very practical way. This is a distinction I already made with the previous slide, but just again, that what is important here, most important, is the VIA classification of strengths as a framework for education. The VIA survey is a very useful tool. We're going to look at some VIA-based practices. Again, the focus here is students rather than our professional development initiatives, but there's a lot of overlap between the two. I'd like to start with this term, strengths fluency, and that's a term that I like to use to sort of describe what it is that we're building. And I break fluency into sort of 2 dimensions. One is strengths awareness, and that has to do with our attentiveness to strengths in ourselves and in others. So that's the awareness piece. And that's the piece that sort of comes first. But then I think it's only valuable if it then leads to what I call strengths dexterity. And that's our capacity really to do 2 things. And that's one, to align specific strengths with specific tasks. To be able to recognize consciously or perhaps even at an unconscious level what strengths are most appropriate to what jobs. And then our capacity to use those strengths to achieve positive outcomes. Not that they always achieve positive outcomes. Part of the process is also, strengths generally serve us well, but sometimes lead in other directions too. And I think an awareness and understanding of that is also a part of strengths fluency. So again, this is just a construct that is sort of helpful in terms of structuring what a strengths intervention can look like. Generally, some of the goals that we're looking for, and this can vary from one's intervention to the next, but discovering and educators and students will, and this is a little different. Most curricular domains, most subject areas, the goals are student specific. Students will be able to do A, B, C, and D. Here, generally, we're looking at both the educators and the students, because we know that if we want students to live and breathe these strengths, educators need to have that fluency. They need to live and breathe those strengths as well. So it really is at both levels there, even though our focus for this presentation is the student interventions. So discovery of strengths and engaging strengths in the classroom across the school community and beyond, using strengths to enhance teaching and learning and promote higher levels of achievement, and collaboration to create a positive strengths-focused culture within the classroom and across the school community. So we have individual goals here at the individual level, at the classroom level, and at the school level. Outcomes that we hope for, and we've got in some of our interventions. We have research pointing to some of these outcomes. But what we're hoping for is to increase engagement, achievement, subjective well-being, help students to improve in self-efficacy, increase empathy and sense of connection with others, and improve positive classroom and school culture. Ambitious outcomes, and in some instances, some of these outcomes I think are more fully realized than others, and in some instances, some of these outcomes are more of a primary focus than others. But in sort of the broad sweep, these are the outcomes that we're looking for and striving for. I'm going to share 5 slides with you, and these are what we've identified as the strands and strategies of character strengths education. That pretty much everything that we've done with VIA-based work in school falls into one of these 5 categories that we think are critical. First and foremost, developing the VIA vocabulary. It's that common language that is so useful and necessary. When we look at academic disciplines, when we look at the field of geometry or music or literature, each of those domains has a vocabulary specific to that domain that allows for common understanding, that allows for common level of comprehension and ability to work within that discipline. That's what VIA provides for the domain of our lives and who we are at our best. And having that common vocabulary is essential and useful in a variety of ways. Noticing and thinking about strengths in others. This is a strand that in some of the earliest strengths interventions was not necessarily stressed as much as it has been with some of the more recent interventions. And we found that this strand is so powerful and important for a variety of reasons, some of which we will touch on in a later slide. Recognizing and thinking about one's own character strengths, of course, is key and kind of central to all of this. Practice using specific strengths and strengths clusters, because in real life, it's very rare that we're using just one strength at a time, but strengths are dynamic, and we use them in combination, and identifying and understanding the combinations. And then this is a strategy that is, some schools have opted to go in this direction. Some have just focused on the first 4 strands. But this is really taking VIA to the group level and looking beyond. Of course, we look at the individual level. What are those signature strengths that define, the essence of who we are as individuals? But if you take that to the class or the school level and identify what are those signature strengths that define who we are as an 8th grade class, or that define who we are as a school. And that's an interesting area. We've seen some schools moving in that direction. One of the schools in Sao Paulo, Pastor Cicero, they have recently identified for their middle school and high school what the top strengths are, and they're developing a very interesting plan to really celebrate and promote and make effective use of those signature strengths across the school. Excuse me. I want to share with you a graph that reflects one of the things that I think we've learned across multiple interventions, and I think it's something that is really key to introducing VIA to students. In the very first intervention I was ever involved with VIA, we introduced students to, had them think about their own strengths sort of right off the bat when we began thinking about VIA strengths. And for some students that was a very easy thing to do, and for others it was a bit of a stretch. And it was starting cold that way, starting with your own strengths without any preparatory set, is problematic for some students. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. We can just go here. One is strengths blindness. Many of us, for a variety of reasons, can be blind to our own strengths. It's hard for us to see the good in ourselves. Easier to see the good in others, but sometimes it's hard to see it in ourselves. Another factor may be modesty, that you know, we're taught, and by nature, many of us just don't want to call attention to the good in ourselves. We might consider it bragging. So for those reasons, I've come to the conclusion that the best way to sort of enter the world of VIA with students is to have them look at strengths beyond themselves and then sort of funnel down from the outward external focus on others down to the self. So first, oftentimes what we do when we introduce the language of VIA, the context may be within using YouTube clips. It may be in terms of talking about strengths with respect to literary characters or historical characters, but sort of getting the language out there, and then moving from that level a little closer to home, having students identify strengths in others, family members, teachers, and what these two types of activities do is they establish a pathway and a receptivity to looking at strengths in oneself. So when we use this funnel approach, we find that by the time that students get to the point where they're thinking about their own strengths, they're primed for it, they're prepped for it, and it tends to go easier. Okay. Okay, there's a question that has just come through about the ages of the students that we're working with, and that's a wide range. And I would say, with respect to most of what I've shared so far, it's middle school and high school, and elementary too. Nothing that we've shared, nothing that I've shared so far is age specific. We're going to look at some of the specific groups. I actually am going to introduce you to a few students in a couple of the different school settings, and you're going to meet a first grader, you're going to meet a sixth grader, you're going to meet an eighth grader. So in terms of the slide we're looking at right now, it really is applicable to any level. One of the things that's been that has been exciting has been increasingly in the past few years, we've realized that VIA-based practices can start very early. And we're going to look at one example of first graders in a school in China who have done phenomenal work with VIA. There was a time when we thought maybe, or at least I thought, that maybe 5th grade was sort of the optimal point to sort of start developing a VIA vocabulary. But then we saw interventions in Geelong Grammar School, saw some phenomenal work being done at 3rd grade level, and so it really, the universality seems to be, is not just cultural universality, but it seems to be across the life spectrum, that very young children understand this in a fairly profound way. I'll just share with you, we're going to look now at just some very specific activities, and I just sort of had to choose. There's a lot to choose from here, but I sort of wanted to go down the funnel, starting with the strengths in others, moving from the external to the internal. So the first thing, this is an activity that was developed in Newark Boys Chorus School. It's a fairly small school. It's a private school that serves students from across Newark, New Jersey. One of the activities that they did is an initial strength spotting activity we developed. Now this is an activity that may not be appropriate in public school because it references a religious holiday, Christmas, but in that context was perfectly appropriate. And we looked at a Charlie Brown Christmas, and simply a very simple activity, but students watched it, and then they sort of analyzed different scenes. So here they're looking at the opening scene and just wondering if there are any character strengths. And this is after or actually as they're learning the language. So at this point, they have the language, they have the definitions, they're starting to use them, and the age range for this group was 4th through 8th grade at Newark Boys Chorus School. We did other, again, this is a simple activity, but looking at getting them to think about the strength of creativity, getting them here to think about the strength of teamwork. So simple, but simple and straightforward, but effective. So just, we have other slides that are part of that activity, but just wanted to give you a taste. Now, as we go down to the next level, we're actually going to look at an activity that really combines both strengths in others and strengths in self. So sometimes these 3 different dimensions can kind of merge. And this next activity came out. It was we were having a meeting with their VIA planning team, and one of the teachers suggested, had an idea that everybody school wound up running with this idea, and it was a really, I think, a very powerful example of strength spotting that incorporates identifying strengths in others and identifying strengths in oneself. So what they did, and this is a practice, and a lot of these best practices start at the teacher level, and this is a case in point. For 2 weeks, the teachers did this activity called the Badge Project, and during that time, the students were observing what was going on, they were getting interested in it, and then eventually they got a chance to do it as well. So what the activity actually was each person had an empty badge holder, and each person received a set of 24 cards containing, as you might guess, one strength listed on each card. On the front of the card was the strength, and on the back of the card was the definition. And so each person has a set of 24 cards, and the objective is, within a 2-week period, see how many cards you can give away. Now, the context for giving a card away is that you spot that strength being used in somebody else. And it has to be a good example, and you also, on the back, you have to write the specific example of how that strength was used. So for the first 2 weeks, you have teachers with these badges, and and when you get the card, you put the card in the badge. Everybody sees that you've just been spotted or identified for using a given strength. And each time somebody spots a strength in you and you get another card, you place that card again in the badge. So it's a real, obviously a very sort of reciprocal sort of activity that shifts the attention to really noticing the good in others. So the teachers did this for a while, and then the students did it for a period of about, they did it for 2 weeks as well. By all accounts, it was a very successful project. Now, when I say I have anecdotally reported outcomes here, because we don't, all we have is the perceptions of the students themselves and the teachers, but there was a very high level of student engagement. I visited the school. I saw that level of engagement, and I think, according to the teachers, some of what resulted from this paying attention to each other's strengths, obviously increased emphasis on what is good in self and others. For anybody who's taught middle school or who has had children who've navigated the challenges of middle school, you know, oftentimes the default mode can go to focusing on what's bad. And what we're doing here is presenting a context that sort of reorients that and tries to counter that default mode. Also, and students themselves reported increased use of strengths. After they did this activity, they were more adept identifying when they were using strengths and really becoming conscious of that. And also, the teachers reported, and also the students, especially the 8th grade students, really emphasized this, that ways in which they felt that this activity had led to a more positive school climate and more positive interactions. I'll just share with you, we have multiple examples of different ways in which this activity had a positive impact on students. I'm going to focus on one student, Naji. Naji is an 8th grade student, and he had a love of learning is definitely a strength for him. But prior to doing this activity, he had reported that he was always sort of trying to suppress his curiosity and love of learning. He was conscious of, he'd be interested in certain subjects, especially he'd be very interested, but he didn't want to put up his hand too much. He didn't want to attract attention. He was concerned about how it would be perceived by others if he really let his love of learning shine. Well, despite these efforts to suppress this strength, during this activity, he received 6 cards, 6 nominations from his peers for love of learning. And as he describes this, what's interesting is not that he, in this case, he knew that he had this quality before, but prior to this experience, he kind of viewed it as a negative. He was almost embarrassed by it. But as a result of this activity, he was able to embrace the love of learning. He saw that others actually respected him because of it, and it was a valued trait. And so that sort of opened the doorway to expressing that and letting that shine in an authentic way. And his teachers were very aware of this, because they said, you know, he just really opened up in class, after this experience. And the teachers themselves didn't know quite why it had happened until later, when we were interviewing the students and we talked to Naji and we got the story, and then talked to teachers about it, and they said, they were kind of amazed by this, because they said there had been a noticeable transformation in terms of his presence and participation in the classroom, and in fact it was concurrent with this badge activity. I'll share one other student, Isaiah, who's a sixth grader, and when he got, and this was actually this occurred, no, I'm sorry, this was not connected to the badge activity. This was connected to the taking the VIA survey. And Isaiah got his results back, and his top strength was spirituality. And we did a video documentary of these students, and you can actually access it on the page that you went to register. There's a link at the bottom. But when we were interviewing Isaiah, and actually we were videotaping in the classroom when the students received their results, and he got up and shared his top strength, which was spirituality, and he was clearly moved by it, and he just said, "I just feel grand. I just feel grand," which I thought was just a really beautiful way of saying it. Then later in a follow-up interview, we just asked him to just talk about that a little more, and he said it's just seeing spirituality, that particular strength as his top strength for him. He said he came back to that same word, grand. He said, it just makes me feel larger. It makes me feel big. And then he sort of gets a little choked up and just says, it just makes me feel better. And I think that is the essence. That is the essence of what this is about, is really connecting in a powerful way with who we are at our best. And that oftentimes that isn't going to happen on its own. Sometimes, what a VIA-based approach does is it provides a context for those discussions and those experiences to happen in a very explicit and sometimes powerful way. This is a practice from Geelong Grammar School, strength spotting best practice. I love this. Pam Barton, she's a fifth grade teacher, and came up with this activity which was focused on a specific strength, but you could do it with other strengths, or even just with VIA strengths in general, just spotting any strength. But this specifically focused on kindness. And each day, students, if they observed a peer doing an act of kindness, they could pick up from the teacher's desk these little templates. You see the little butterflies on the wall, and those are little paper cutouts, and there's a space to identify the name of the person, what the kind act was that you observed, and so students fill these out and drop them in the net, the butterfly net, and at the end of the day, the teacher empties the net, and everybody gathers around, and they share the butterflies and talk about what they observed. So a really wonderful way to validate, in this instance, the strength of kindness, but as I said, can be used in any way. These were just some of the anecdotally reported outcomes that the teacher recognized. I'll go through this section pretty quickly, but these are sort of important lessons learned, and I won't get into all the rationale, I'll just hit them, but things that in doing these interventions we've come to certain conclusions, and we'll just share what the conclusions are. One is striking the right balance between a focus on students looking at their own strengths and focusing on other strengths. I think for a lot of reasons, which I won't get into right now in the interest of time, that balance is important. This is huge. Presenting VIA survey results. When you do use the VIA survey as a tool, present the results in perspective. And by in perspective, I'm saying as one of many possible lenses through which to identify and reflect upon strengths. I like the multiple lens approach. Here, the multiple lens or the 360. The VIA is a scientific tool. It's extremely helpful, but it is one lens. It's one snapshot, a very detailed snapshot, but but it's one lens. In the earliest version of strengths work, we would start with the VIA survey sort of at the outset, and one of the things that we noticed was students sometimes put too much emphasis on the specific results and felt as though the VIA was sort of a definitive and comprehensive assessment, that whatever ranking was there was sort of summed them up in their entirety. And I think that we want to use those results in the right way, but we also want, as we've seen throughout, is what strengths do your friends see in you? What strengths do family members and others see in you? Emphasize, and this is important, we sort of touched on this before, but that strengths are dynamic and interconnected. In real life, we use strengths in complex ways. It's rare that we're only using the strength of social intelligence. We're oftentimes using social intelligence with any number of other strengths. Recognize the richness and the complexity and the nuance of this work. If we reduce it to very simplistic terms, we do our students a disservice. The VIA strengths are constructs for allowing us to think about and talk about dimensions of our being. And those dimensions, as I said, are interconnected, and it's important to acknowledge that. Frank Mosca uses a metaphor which I love. He says that we should think of our strengths as sort of, we're the conductor of an orchestra, and our respective strengths are the different sections of an orchestra. Some of them are signature strengths that we use all of the time. The first and second violins and the cellos, we rely on those. We need to rely on them in a lot of instances. The triangle up in the upper left-hand corner there, it has a role to play, and when we need a triangle, only a triangle will do. But there are some strengths that we call upon rarely, some strengths that we call upon on a daily basis. But the important point is, just as in a piece of music, at any given point in time, what we need changes. From bar to bar, from measure to measure in a musical composition, what we need to do the job changes. And again, it just emphasizes the dynamic nature of strengths as they really function in our lives. Always focus on the practical benefits and challenges. There's no reason to integrate a VIA-based approach unless it serves us. And what are the benefits when we use strengths? What are the benefits? Strengths, virtue is good in and of itself, but we have to look at the practical benefits. And for students, that practical benefit has to be there, otherwise it's not relevant. Also, don't shy away from talking about the negative outcomes that can come along with overuse or underuse of strengths as well. Strengths usually, direct us in positive ways, but sometimes overuse, underuse is also a factor as well. I want to respect the time here, so I was going to share with you an example from Shanghai American School. They're using reading and stories in particular to introduce the language of VIA, but then students make their own connections to the strengths, and it's remarkable. We're currently working on a video that documents some of these classes and students. It's really interesting to hear first graders talk about their strength of authenticity and curiosity. Here are some photos from outside one of the classrooms. These are some strengths profiles that first graders did. Here's one up close. For this activity, they identified one strength, which I think is a good starting point, one of their top strengths. And for this first grader, quite impressively, self-control is a top strength. And I have it confirmed by the teacher that in fact this is a first grader who exercises a lot of self-control. So even though it's a lower strength for many, young and old, for this student it's actually right on the money. I'll share a little bit about Ian. Ian is a first grade student, and he had struggled during the first part of his first grade year on the playground, because a lot of the boys wanted to do sort of shoot 'em up, sorts of games on the playground, and rather, a rougher form of play than he was comfortable with, and he was much more comfortable to interact with girls and to engage in their activities, and was a bit of a struggle for him. But through the strengths work, he and his teacher were able to talk about the strength of authenticity, which had been demonstrated in some of the books that they read. And Ian wound up really embracing this strength and seeing that doing what's true to him, if playing with the girls on the playground is what he wants to do, that is in fact what he should do. And so there's a scene in the documentary of Ian talking about this strength and how he uses that strength on the playground. And again, to see first graders use the language and to use it in a way that's reflects an authentic understanding of who they are and how those strengths work is pretty impressive. And I think the important point here is it's in this example, it's not just identifying a strength, but the discussion of the strength led to a positive outcome. He was uncomfortable at the beginning of this process, but through the process of identifying and then embracing the strength led to a very positive outcome. The study, another way to embed, and this is specific to high school, to embed the study of strengths is within the context of literature study, which is what my background is. Initially, I was an English teacher, and one of the things, literature and VIA are a perfect match, because literature is first and foremost, the reason we teach literature is it's a vehicle for reflecting on who and what we are. Okay, learning literary techniques is nice, but that's not why we study literature. We study it to gain a broader understanding of who we are at our core, and that is, of course, the business of VIA. And so a perfect marriage here. Here's just one example of sort of that marriage, and looking at strengths in a literary context and then addressing, relating them on the personal level. When we looked at the Odyssey, of course, the Odyssey is a series of challenges that Odysseus faces on his way home to Ithaca from the Trojan War, and he encounters these obstacles. And really, from a psychological perspective, each of these obstacles represents a different type of challenge in our life. For instance, the Cyclops represents the situation where we're trapped and it seems like there's no way out, that we're more or less doomed. But of course, Odysseus uses his strengths, a variety of strengths, social intelligence and curiosity, to really manage that situation in a way that is advantageous for himself and for most of his men, not all of his men. And so as students look at how did Odysseus use strengths to confront his challenges, we have students say, what are your Cyclops challenges? What are those instances when you're trapped, and it seems like there's no way out, and how do you use your strengths in those situations? And generally these reflections happen within the context of writing exercises and then sharing. Another example would be Odysseus and the Sirens. Very interesting example, because Odysseus, he resists temptation, but he resists it in a way that he's also allowed to experience it. If you know the story, he could have done what he had the rest of his men do, which was to clog up his ears with wax so he wouldn't hear the the alluring call of the sirens. What he wants to do is he wants to experience it, but he wants to be safe from harm. So he comes up with sort of an ingenious way. He has himself tied to the mast, so he can't jump overboard, he can't do harm to himself, but yet he can still experience a bit of this sound. So it's sort of prudence and appreciation of beauty and excellence coming together. He's wants the experience, but he's also using that using the prudence to safeguard himself from harm. So have students identify what are their temptations and really reflect on what are the strengths that they bring to bear there. In the interest of time, I'm going to bypass this activity. I was going to talk about an activity we used in Brazil involving strength cards, which we actually have versions of these in English. Here you're seeing some examples of the Portuguese versions that we've used, and they're like playing cards, and it's a great resource to do a whole range of different sorts of interactive activities related to strengths work. One of my favorite pictures there. Oh, if we could all be that cat when we needed to be. I think I would be remiss if I did not include a slide. A lot of the interventions that have been done have not been researched and studied, but the one that has been well studied and documented, the program at Strathaven High School. This was a positive psychology program, but about 2/3 of the content was VIA based. So VIA figured very prominently in that intervention, and these are the outcomes that were statistically significant. There were also domains where there weren't outcomes or statistically significant outcomes, but in each of these areas there were significant gains for the test group over and above those in the control group. If you're interested in the details and the data on this, you can please feel free to contact me. My email is on the last slide. I just want to acknowledge some individuals here. What I'm drawing on here reflects a lot of work in a lot of different schools. Some great champions, Jay Sharp, who one of the real pioneers with VIA work at Bella Vista Elementary School. The two teachers at Shanghai, Sarah and Jennifer, who are just have done great work with integrating VIA in reading. Albert Holtzacker in Sao Paulo, who's leading the charge there. Mike Sanfilippo and Larry Emery at Newark Boys Course School, and the team of teachers and administrators involved with the Strathaven project. Finally, just acknowledgments, Mayerson Academy, with whom we're currently working in Cincinnati, everybody at VIA, Ryan and the entire team, Jane Gillum, who has been instrumental in a lot of ways, both in terms of program development and measurements. And in fact, we have a middle school in upstate New York, which is going to, once the school board approves it, which is pretty much imminent, we're going to be doing a study there, which is going to involve both professional development and curriculum. A wide range of outcomes are going to be measured, and it's always good to have research based outcomes. So we're looking forward to that project, and Mary Judd is very instrumental in that. And finally, just want to say thank you to Chris for everything. So I had the very good fortune when I was in Australia. Chris and I shared living space for a period of about a month, and everything that you can imagine about Chris in terms of just his integrity, his sense of humor, his playfulness, it was great to see that up close. And I fondly remember weekends exploring the countryside of Victoria. And one of the memories that sticks with me most was driving through a rural area, and there was a family whose car had gotten stuck in a muddy ditch. And as we were approaching the scene, Chris said 3 words: "Other people matter." And with that, we pulled to the side of the road and spent the better part of 15 minutes. Chris and Nansuk Park and myself and a farmer who hopped off from a neighboring field who hopped off of his tractor, and we did what had to be done. But thank you, Chris, for VIA and for everything you've given to us. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you so much, Mark. And it's definitely an emotional time for many of us here with the loss of Chris. And I do want to say, in terms of the presentation here, thank you very much for taking the time to do this. We have a few questions here that come from people from various places that we'd like to pose to you. And I just wanted to say that in listening to your presentation here, sometimes when we hear a presentation, there's just so many ideas, concepts, research points, practices, and it's and it kind of leaves us just kind of simultaneously kind of feeling overflowing with such wonderful information, and also craving more. And I think that I maybe speak for a lot of people that that's what you've left us with, is hungry for so much more, but also so inspired by all these different projects that you're engaged in, these ideas. You've covered really a whole lot of material here in such a short time, and so thanks so much for that. So a couple different questions here before we close. One of them, kind of going specifically, you've done a great job, Mark, of giving some very general concepts and general ideas for people to put forth at a systems level, and also just in their thinking from kind of almost a philosophical level and how they approach teaching. But then also you've gone specific into specific details of what people can do to make a difference for kids. So here's one of those detail-oriented questions, and this one are for a specific population. And this one is: I'm working on elementary school curriculum for gifted kids. We're struggling with how to assess growth. Any ideas?
I assume that the growth is relative to strengths. Was that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
I think so.
Yeah, right. Now, in a situation like that, I think that, and especially this is true at the elementary through high school level, but if students, a lot of times measuring what matters most with this work, which is really at the individual level, involves having them do some sort of reflection and thinking about or talking about how specifically they're using strengths in specific ways. So I think one example that comes to mind is a teacher at Geelong Grammar School who had third grade students use, they had identified their signature strengths. Of course, they were too young to use the VIA. They used other measures, teacher observation, peer observations, and then also activities identifying strengths in yourself, which you can do with small kids with very with clear direction and focus. But what I really loved about his work was he tied it to he kept a profile, and the students maintained this profile during the course of the year, and they were really looking at how they use strengths across time. And they had a very specific record of examples of strengths they used and how they used them. And it was actually tied in with, I don't want to say assessment because their strengths were not being formally assessed, but And I would strongly discourage against any attempt to grade character strengths per se in terms of a numerical value, but identifying strengths and calling out student strengths is very powerful. And what this teacher did is he had the students create videos that were used during parent-teacher conferences. So the student would create a video where he or she would talk about the strengths that he or she used throughout the year, how he uses them on the playground, in the class, at home. So the student is communicating via this video to his parents. This is the first thing the parents see when they come to the parent-teacher conference. And also included on that, the student would first talk about his or her own strengths, but then the student would say, now that I know this via language, I think I know what your top strengths are, Mom and Dad. And the student would share his observations about his parents' strengths. So anyway, the answer to your question is I think if you can, I think growth has to be measured really kind of at the individual level. If we want to see what sort of gains we're making across time. Okay. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Mark. Another question is, what advice do you have for me as a principal who wants to embed VIA character strengths in our school's curriculum? Now, you've answered this question to some degree, so maybe we could kind of frame it as in next steps. So, like, let's say that there probably is several callers who are in administration, or not callers, several people on the line here listening to this talk that are in administration. Maybe they're principals, maybe they have a lead role at the school as a teacher, and they're pretty new to VIA. They might like the VIA, they want to apply it. And so, what would the people that are kind of new at this stuff? What would you say would be the very next step? They've heard your call, they've been inspired, they want to do something more with their school. They're like, I want to bring it to my classroom, I want to bring it more in the school. What would be the next one, maybe two steps for them?
Well, a couple possibilities. One would be, and I'm going to recommend, because different school situations, my answer would be different in different situations. So I'm going to give you my email address, and please feel free to email me. But I think the first step has to be professional development, and creating a staff that truly understands and believes that a focus on strengths is important. And there are a number of different ways that you can move in that direction. And again, if you email me, I'll be happy to share some specific ideas about possible avenues for doing that professional development. I've seen examples where school leaders have themselves just immerse themselves in strengths work and positive psychology, and have sort of on their own inspired the staff and trained the staff. There are also options to bring in trainers from the outside. But the first step does have to be, I think, has to be meaningful professional development, so that your staff members do, in fact, live and breathe this work.
Great, thank you. And maybe just one more question. There are some others, but for the effort of time, we'll just do one more. And so this question is what is the biggest lesson learned from your experiences in positive education, some of the different initiatives at Geelong and at Strathaven? So maybe it's like one particular adage or phrase people can keep in mind, or what's one core lesson from the time at Geelong, and then one core lesson that you learned from your work doing the research and project at Strathaven.
I guess the sort of biggest just takeaway piece is that when we work with teachers, one of the starting points is really getting them to think about why they went into teaching in the first place, and inevitably that discussion. We talked a little bit about the lessons learned earlier, the lessons learned activity. What were the teachers that most inspired you? And the core there, and the message that comes out time and again from teachers, is they understand the role that they play in students' lives and what they signed on to do. And in too many instances, the scope of what we do with students and the discussions that we have with students don't venture into the domain of who we are at our core. And most educators understand why that's important, and I think that's an impulse that has led many teachers into the profession. And unfortunately, because of federal and state mandates, too many teachers find themselves unable to devote the sort of time. They're making a difference in any way that they can, but we need doing this work, and doing this work well takes time, and it takes an understanding that talking about who we are at our core does in fact matter. And yes, it will actually, in many instances, improve achievement. That is what seems to be all important, and it should be important. But above and beyond that, it's going to improve the quality of our lives and the quality of our relationships with others. And so, in some ways, I hear myself. I hope this doesn't sound trite, because for me, it's the opposite of trite. It's as profound as can be, and it touches on why we do what we do, and hopefully, that's why I'm optimistic about Paul Tuff's book, because I'm hoping it might help us to move in the right direction. But I think that's the direction we need to go.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much again, Mark, for all your time and all the great work that you're putting out there. And I think I speak for many of us in that we really look forward to hearing about all the great things that you'll continue to do. Lots of great things have already been happening, and truly, there are so many wonderful things happening and going to be happening in the short term and long term. And let me say one more thing also, that I should have maybe mentioned this at the very beginning, is that VIA is actually working hard on a brief youth survey. So hopefully, as this education track continues, we'll be able to kind of update all of you on when that's going to be available. But so far, it looks like the validation of it looks like it's going well. So now you won't have to have kids between the ages of 10 and 17 take a survey that's 198 questions long, although that's very good. But a lot of people tell us there's lots of inconveniences with that, and so we'll have a survey that's less than 100, and so that'll help researchers and practitioners and people who work in school. So stay posted on that. We're hoping that will come out soon, as well as a youth report that the teachers and parents will be able to purchase for kids as well. And I'm going to pass it back to Mark briefly here.
I thought I had a slide with my email contact, and I can't seem to find it. So if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to touch base. And my email address is marklinkins, MarkLinkins, @yahoo.com. Thank you.
This session has been dedicated to Chris Peterson.